So we've been really appreciative having you with us. He started off his graduate work, or at least philosophy work, at University of Dallas, correct?
That's right.
And then switched over to Maynooth University, which is in Ireland, which is where he wanted to travel. Were you going to travel? Yeah, you were going to travel there, weren't you, this month?
Yes, I was supposed to defend my dissertation on Monday, March 30th.
Okay. And if it weren't for that darn coronavirus, you'd be Dr. Boulter right now, right?
It's okay. It's okay to cuss, Greg. You can, like, I know I'm a priest, but you know, it's fine.
Well, let's just keep it clean today, Matt.
All right.
So I was talking to Matt before we started today, and we agreed that we would. He's going to try to pack it all into this hour and a half. We're going to go from 4:30 to 6. If you can stay the whole time, great. If you can't, that's okay too. We'll have the chat box open. I'll be checking that from time to time. I'll be moderating. But he also said that you should feel welcome to just ask questions. And so I'll go ahead and mute everybody right now. But if you have a question to ask, you can feel free to unmute yourself. And I think there's a way to raise your hand in a meeting like that, correct? I'll try to keep an eye open on the chat, and if I need to, I can read a question to you, Matt. All right?
Great.
All right, Matt, I'll just turn it over to you.
Perfect. I'm going to start my timer. I'm going to try to talk for an hour and 15 minutes. Does that sound all right, Greg?
That's fine.
Good. Okay, y'all, thank you so much. Big thanks to Greg Bock. I am here to talk about my dissertation, which I submitted about 5 months ago. Those plans were dashed, but alas, patience is a virtue, right? The title of my dissertation is Repetition and Mythos. That word mythos is a word that we'll come back to over and over again in the next hour or so. I spell it M-Y-T-H-O-S. It's the Greek word for story or narrative or myth. The title of my dissertation is Repetition and Mythos, Ratzinger's Bonaventure and the Meaning of History. So I wrote my dissertation on essentially this book. Can y'all see this? This is the Theology of History in Saint Bonaventure by Joseph Ratzinger. It was translated into English and published, I want to say, in 1971. But this right here is the German version. Now, you will see that this is rather large. This right here is volume 2 of Ratzinger's Gesammelte Schriften, his collected works. So technically this volume was published, I think, in like 2011. And it is, so it's a critical revision, you might say, of his Habilitationsschrift. I want to try to keep this simple. It is so complicated. A Habilitationsschrift, as many of you know, is like a second dissertation that one has to submit in Europe in order to be the chair of a department. And Ratzinger wrote his first doctorate on Augustine's ecclesiology. And I'm going to be using a ton of theological terms in this talk. And so any questions that you have, please raise your hand. His first dissertation was on Augustine's ecclesiology, but then his second dissertation was on St. Bonaventure's theology of history. Now, when he submitted that dissertation, essentially it was this big. However, his committee basically rejected it, and this sent him into a tailspin of anxiety and turmoil. As he was looking over his graded papers that had been marked up by his committee, he realized that out of the 3 sections, 2 of them were totally marked up with tons of red inks in the margins and the word 9 scribbled all over the place. But one of the 3 sections was remarkably clean. And so he had this brilliant idea. He went back, he reread that one section, he revised it, and then he resubmitted it as an independent text, and it was accepted. Does that make sense? So that accepted portion is what was translated into English. And that accepted portion is basically this section right here in the critical edition of his collected works that was published in 2011. Does that make sense? So I wrote my dissertation basically on this section, although I had to take the other two sections into account, but technically I didn't treat them in any detail at all. This is his second dissertation, or his Habilitationsschrift, that was translated into English, and the title is The Theology of History in St. Bonaventure. Does that make sense? All right. I want to say that my three muses for my dissertation, in addition to Joseph Ratzinger himself, and if you haven't seen the Netflix show The Two Popes, it's pretty good. I would recommend it. But in addition to Ratzinger, my muses for my dissertation, I would say, are C.S. Lewis, Catherine Pickstock, who is a British theologian at Cambridge, and also Hans-Georg Gadamer, who you might call the founder of 20th century philosophical hermeneutics. Gadamer was a pupil of Heidegger's, and so I would say C.S. Lewis, Catherine Pickstock, and Gadamer are my three muses for this project, the three that I derive the most inspiration from. And I want to introduce my lecture now. And the way I was going to do that, I was going to play upon your coronavirus fears. And I was going to bring up all sorts of exhibits from popular culture that have to do with apocalyptic. So over the last few years, I would say over the last decade or so, there's been a ton of apocalyptic stories, films, books, series, TV shows online, Netflix, Hulu, etc. For example, Bird Box, The Walking Dead, A Quiet Place, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, published in 2007, and World War Z. All of these are what you might call apocalyptic, end of the world type works or stories. And those have been very common over the last decade or two, perhaps in response to the climate change crisis. But I think that what we've been seeing over the last 3 or 4 weeks, ever since the coronavirus became a thing, especially in the US, is just a massive increase of these apocalyptic cultural artifacts. So for example, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago on the opinion page, someone wrote an article called "Why Am I Reading Apocalyptic Novels Now?" And it says, like many others, I've been finding my taste in books and movies turning in an apocalyptic direction. I also find myself much less able than usual to hold these made up stories at a safe distance from myself. Previously, the author gives a little summary of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Have y'all read Cormac McCarthy's The Road, by the way? Very good book. The story involves a father and a son, and this particular author, who happens to be a philosophy professor writing in the New York Times, says that father is me. In other words, the father character in Cormac McCarthy's book, that father character is me. That child is my 11-year-old son. Their plight penetrates past the just fiction shell, forcing me to ask, is this what the beginning of the end of the world looks like? I feel panicked. I cannot fall asleep. That's one example of many, of just in the last couple of weeks, apocalyptic becoming a big topic in our culture. There's lots of other examples. For example, a Washington Post article with the title, "Prepping for Coronavirus is just like prepping for doomsday." And it's kind of crazy. I mean, these are not supposed to be funny. People are actually, in a new way, maybe for the first time in my lifetime, entertaining the actual end of the world in a way that's unprecedented. And I was going to talk about that, but instead, I'm going to open up like this. Be it resolved. Humanity's best days lie ahead. Mankind has progressed and is progressing and will continue to progress. Now, I don't know if y'all saw the Munk Debate, which was held in 2015. The Munk Debates are always in Toronto. They're a semi-annual series of debates on policy issues. That debate, the one in 2015, featured the European philosopher Alain de Botton arguing against the resolution that humanity's best days lie ahead. And he was arguing against the cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker, who was arguing in favor of the resolution. Pinker was arguing that things are getting better and better, history is progressing, and will continue to progress. Pinker, in other words, thinks that the world, that is to say, human life on planet Earth, is progressively improving, getting better and better. On what basis does Pinker argue this position? On the basis, at least this is what he'd say, on the basis of facts, numerical trends, and statistics. And yet, I wonder if it's ever occurred to Pinker that until a certain point in history, no thinker in the history of human culture had ever made such a claim as this. Indeed, I wonder if it's ever occurred to Pinker that the impetus for this original claim made by a Benedictine monk named Joachim of Fiore in the 12th century, I wonder if it's ever occurred to Steven Pinker that that original claim was made not on the basis of numbers, trends, or supposed facts, but rather on the basis of theology. Indeed, as many modern thinkers, and I'm thinking of people like Karl Löwit, also a student of Martin Heidegger, also Henri de Lubac, also Joseph Ratzinger himself, as many modern thinkers have argued, this confidence in modern progress is at its root a theological claim, whether acknowledged or not. Why is this? It's because of the nature of history. Belief in human cultural progress of the kind endorsed by Pinker assumes that history is intelligible. In other words, history is something like mathematics or logic, something which is transparent to human reason, something that can be rationally understood. And although this claim that history is intelligible, although this claim has been disputed by many thinkers down through the ages, names like Aristotle and Nietzsche come to mind, others have insisted that Pinker's assumption is correct. History is a domain which human beings can make sense of. How can this be? How can history be regarded as rationally penetrable in a manner analogous to logic or math? Many astute thinkers argue that it is thanks to theology. And I'm thinking of people like Joseph Pieper right now, as well as G.W.F. Hegel. Theology, in other words, is what renders history intelligible. For it is the rational discourse which takes certain events in history to be philosophically determinative, events such as the death and resurrection of Christ. But further reflection shows that this deliverance of theology is rooted in a still deeper truth, that history is regarded as by Christians as a story, the history of salvation of God's people. I'm going to pause real quick, and I want to say what I'm trying to argue here is that the philosophy of history, not epistemology, not ethics, but the philosophy of history relies on theology. That's a claim that Joseph Pieper makes, by the way, in this book, The End of Time. That's what I'm trying to argue right now in this introduction. In other words, unless history is a narrative, it can make no sense. And the one discourse which gives full weight to the narratival character of history is theology. Hence, as Hegel and Löwit admit, any true philosophy of history will assume the basic validity of revealed theology. Now, an atheist can be a philosopher of history. I'm not making any claims to the contrary there. But from a historical point of view, or maybe more to the point from a historicist point of view, the philosophy of history presupposes the validity of revealed theology. Otherwise, there can be no coherent philosophy of history. Now, I want to sum up this introduction. So far, I've argued 3 points. One, that belief in historical progress or progressivism is a culturally conditioned concept, which was made possible only by a particular theological move by Joachim of Fiore in the 12th century, an intellectual shift which is the condition of the possibility for philosophical historicism. For example, the philosophical historicism of Hegel. 2, this move of Joachim's presupposes that history is meaningful because it has been revealed as a coherent narrative. And then thirdly, without this narratival conception of history bequeathed to us by theology, no one would regard history as meaningful or rationally graspable. Hence, Pinker could not make his claim. Pinker, that is dependent upon the historically conditioned intellectual development of Joachim of Fiore, whether he realizes it or not. Put it another way, Pinker's vision of a progressively improving historical trajectory is really a kind of secular eschatology. But this secular eschatology itself depends upon real eschatology, that is, eschatology which regards the biblical story or the historius salutis as, in some sense, valid. Now, the remainder of my talk today will proceed along the basis of 3 big headings. Number 1, history. Number 2, story or narrative. And number 3, eschatology. Under these 3 headings, then, I will now summarize my dissertation. Are we good? All right. Y'all, I've got 3 pages of notes, and let's see what happens. I'm at this 15-minute mark right now. Okay, can everyone see my slideshow, my PowerPoint presentation? All right, good. So the title of this lecture, which is a summary of my dissertation, is The Story of Reality, Ratzinger's Bonaventure on the Beginning, Middle, and End of the World. I hope that you can see how this is about the philosophy of history, it's about eschatology, and therefore it's also connected to this notion of apocalyptic. I can define all those terms, but I'm just gonna keep going for now. Okay, all right, here we go. That was the introduction. Okay, that was the introduction. I've talked a little bit about apocalyptic and eschatology in pop culture. Let me define the term eschatology. The Greek word eschaton means last, the last thing. You could think of it as the opposite of arche. If arche means the beginning of something, then the eschaton is the end. So eschatology, which as far as I know, is really and truly, historically speaking, a theological concept. Eschatology means the study of the last things or the study of the final things. Yeah, I've also talked a little bit about C already. I've given you some very brief background on Ratzinger's Habilitationsschrift. That's his second dissertation. I want to say 2 more things about C, some very, very brief background before I move on. 2 things. Number 1, the reason why his committee, one person in particular, a man named Schmaus. Schmaus is a 20th century Catholic neo-Thomist. I don't expect all of you to know what I mean by a neo-Thomist, but I do expect some of you to, especially if your PhD is from Marquette. What the committee member that rejected his submitted text did so on the basis that he thought that Ratzinger's work was modernist. In other words, this particular man, Schmaus, was sort of like a hardcore proponent of old school neo-Thomism. And he thought that Ratzinger was introducing a kind of modernism, in particular because Ratzinger was putting forth an interpretation of Bonaventure's notion of revelation, such that revelation always requires a human interpretation. In other words, there's no such thing as revelation that's uninterpreted. So think about Moses in Exodus 3, Moses in the burning bush. Or think about Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20, who's the first one to see or have any kind of experience with the risen Christ. Ratzinger's claim is that for Bonaventure, all acts of revelation always already include a human interpretation. And for Schmaus, the Neo-Thomist, that sounded like subjectivism. It sounded like some kind of modernism, which would undermine revelation. I don't think that was Ratzinger's point at all. But anyway, that was the motivation for Schmaus to reject 2/3 of the original text that Ratzinger submitted. The second thing I want to say about letter C here, by way of very brief background, it's interesting that in the one text that Ratzinger wrote that deals with history, or you might say the philosophy of history, or you might say the logos of history, the one text that Ratzinger sought to bring to the public dealing with that topic is the only one that was sort of problematic. Ratzinger, nothing else that he submitted was ever rejected, was ever super harshly criticized. It was only this one work dealing with the philosophy of history that caused problems for him. And let me tell you why that's so interesting, because the same exact thing happened with Saint Bonaventure. So Ratzinger's text obviously deals with Saint Bonaventure, who was a frenemy of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And what's so riveting to me is that Bonaventure also has one particular work that he gave, the only one in the history of his career, which for him happened to be the last work he ever submitted, the Collationes in Hexaemeron, which means the sermons on the 6 days, aka Genesis 1. That was the only text that Bonaventure was ever unable to complete. In other words, for both of these thinkers, Ratzinger in the 20th century, Bonaventure in the 13th, for each one of them, whenever they came around to writing about the philosophy of history, they had big time problems. All right, it can't be just a coincidence. So that's some very brief background on Ratzinger's Habilitationsschrift. Look with me at letter D. To get clear on last things, and this is going to move us into my first major section on history. To get clear on last things, many thinkers would say that you first have to get clear on first things. In other words, in order to understand eschatology, you also need to get clear on the nature of history, okay? Now, I'm tempted to go off on a rabbit trail here, but I'm not going to. I just want to say that, like, I'm 47 years old. I've grown up in the church. I've been studying theology and scripture and eschatology for at least 3 decades. And I've never, ever had a teacher suggest to me that in order to understand eschatology properly, you first have to understand history. I've never had anyone say that to me. And I've certainly never had anyone say to me that in order to understand eschatology, you need to have a coherent understanding of Genesis 1, okay? And yet, that is exactly how St. Augustine and many others think of it. In other words, it's really for St. Augustine and also the whole patristic community that insist, if you want to understand eschatology properly, you need to understand history. In other words, what I want to say is that St. Augustine and also others like St. Basil the Great were part of what's called a hexaemeral tradition, this tradition that began with Philo of Alexandria, this tradition of writing commentaries on Genesis 1. This is called hexaemeral literature. Okay, it's also very Neoplatonic, and we'll get to that soon enough, I hope. Okay, what I want to do now is talk about history, and in particular, the 6 days of creation. Should I hit the pause button and just ask if anyone has any questions at this point? All right, hearing none, I will continue. So Roman numeral 1, the 6 days. And y'all, I want to draw your attention. I'm going to show you a picture now. This is a very straightforward sort of picture of the 6 days of creation, or 7, as presented in Genesis 1. Day 1, light. Can y'all see the picture, by the way? Good. Day 2, firmament. Right here it says waters, but for when Bonaventure was reading this out of the Latin Vulgate, the word there would have been firmament. So day 1, light. Day 2, firmament. Day 3, seed-bearing vegetation, okay? Day 4, the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars, all right? Now, remember how I said that both Ratzinger and Bonaventure were unable to successfully complete their work on the philosophy of history? Well, Bonaventure only made it through day 4. So when he was writing his Collationes in Hexaemeron, he actually never made it to days 5 and 6. And hopefully I will come back to that soon. In my dissertation, I try to sort of do a deconstructive reading of that fact, and I attempt to make an argument that that's not mere history. There's something profoundly theological going on there, and why don't I just tell you what that is? My argument, and I'm going to get there in a moment, is that for Bonaventure, the first 4 days of creation are structurally identical to the 4 moments of Plato's line that we find at the end of Book 6 of the Republic, okay? But we're going to come back to that in a minute. First, look with me at letter A. When Bonaventure, and he's very much working in this hexaemeral tradition, part and parcel with Augustine and others, when Bonaventure reads the 6 days, or the days of creation in Genesis 1, he sees them as a progression of intellectual light. In other words, he sees the days of creation as kind of like an intellectual journey of the mind. In my dissertation, I say that let me just keep going. So point number 1 is that the days of creation for this hexaemeral tradition, they're not to be taken as literal history. What they are taken to be an example of, or an articulation of, is a journey of the mind, a kind of intellectual journey on the part of the intelligent creature or the human being, okay? B, here's what I alluded to a minute ago. The 6 days of creation, or I really should have said the 4 days of creation, the days of creation are structurally identical to Plato's line. And here we see that my work is one of philosophical hermeneutics. Philosophical hermeneutics is a discipline that really, it has many, many unique characteristics, but 2 big themes. One is the historical nature of the human person, this idea that what it means to be a human is to be historically conditioned, the idea that we don't really have language or history, but language and history have us. And I think that you can see that in my dissertation to some extent, but also, I think that my work is here seen to be one of philosophical hermeneutics because I'm attending to the nature of human understanding. That's also a big theme, beginning with Heidegger and Gadamer, and also Husserl before Heidegger and others. But I'm attending here to the structure and the nature of human understanding. In other words, it's a hermeneutic endeavor that I'm engaged in here, okay? Let's move to Plato's line. And we're gonna go to a picture again. I found this about 10 minutes before I logged on. The 4 moments of Plato's line, and again, these occur at the end of Book 6 of the Republic. It goes from A to, I'm just gonna say D, and I usually envision it as a vertical line, and there's 4 moments of the line. There's akasia, or images, or maybe imageness. Akasia, the Greek word for image is akon or icon. You've got eikasia. Then you have pistis. Now, does anyone know what pistis means in Greek? Are y'all muted? If you are, it's okay. Does anyone know what, yep. Anyone know what pistis means in Greek?
Faith.
That's right. It means faith.
Faith, trust, or confidence.
Exactly, exactly. So you've got eikasia, then you have pistis, faith, trust, confidence. Then you have dianoia. What is dianoia? Dianoia is the process of moving through units of intelligibility. Thomas Aquinas calls it componendo et dividendo. It's what happens whenever you move through a rational argument. Like, think about a geometry proof in your geometry high school textbook, or to allude to St. Augustine in Book 11 of the Confessions, it's what happens whenever you read through a narrative and you're taking bits of information and putting them together and taking them apart in certain ways. So you've got eikasia, pistis, dianoia, and then at the top of the line, the climax of the whole process for Plato is noesis. I think you could also say nous there, noesis. You could think of that as contemplation, but really what's in mind there is mind, nous, mindfulness. Okay. Now that we've looked at that picture, I'm going to go back a little bit more slowly. No, I think that's good for now. Eikasia, imageness; pistis, faith or trust; dianoia, rational synthesis and dialectic; noesis, the comprehending mind in its final resting gaze. Now, we're going to come back to this, I hope, but one of the things that I want to point out right now, you know what? Never mind. We'll get there later. I want to jump now to the days of creation and try to convince you that days 1 through 4 are structurally identical to these 4 segments of Plato's line, okay? So we looked at the little picture of the days of creation. I probably jumped there prematurely. But the way, I might need to clarify those moments of Plato's line. If I need to do that, I can do that. I'm going to just jump to the days of creation. So day 1, what was created on day 1? Who can tell me what was created on day 1? Okay, even a kindergartner could answer this question. Greg, I know you know.
Light in the dark?
Light, and I would say light. I would not say light and dark, I would say light. Now, what Bonaventure understands this to be talking about is, you could say natural reason, you could say the mind enlightened, or you could say the intellectual light of reason, okay? So I hope that already you're able to see how this notion of light and intellect and the natural light of reason, and this is a very Neoplatonic way of speaking, but I hope that already you can sort of see how that links up with the notion of images. Images require light. Images are a visual phenomenon that makes sense only given the reality of light, okay? Let's move to day 2. On day 2, it says that it was the firmament that was created. And Bonaventure, as well as Augustine and others in the hexameral tradition, understands by firmament faith. On day 2, what we see is the mind elevated by faith, not illuminated by reason, but elevated by faith, or the intellectual light of grace. Bonaventure literally says in the context of day 2 that what happens on day 2 is that natural reason is firmed up. And the Latin word is firmamentum, which does include this notion of something being firmed up or strengthened or made stronger, okay? So on day 2, the firmament, what Bonaventure thinks is going on is the mind enlightened by faith, or the intellectual light of grace, okay? Day 3 is where things get really interesting and kind of crazy. On day 3, what was created on day 3? The seed-bearing vegetation, right? But what Bonaventure thinks is that this is really a way of talking about scripture. Now, who can remind me what we saw on that third segment of Plato's line? It's dianoia, right? And I hope that you understand that dianoia is this rational synthesis, argumentation, the process of reading, putting things together, making distinctions. All of that is seen as dianoia. The Latin translation of the word dianoia is ratio. And I think that usually what thinkers associate with dianoia is things like science, scientia, episteme. Now, what's interesting is that, okay, so let me just say that if you can imagine Plato's line, and if you can imagine him envisioning a kind of process, the process sort of starts out with visual perception of images, and then, confidence or faith that the images that I perceive are actually real. That's where pistis comes in. Pistis is what makes the thinker ontologically assured. That's a term from Cornelius Castoriadis. Pistis is what makes the thinker assured that objects are more than just visual images, that they actually exist in the world. So acacia and pistis together give the thinker a notion that there really are objects in the world, chairs, trees, etc. But then the next moment in this progression is dianoia, beginning to take the things that we see, to analyze them, to articulate them in language, to take that information, put it together, and take it apart. That's dianoia. What I want to say to you, though, is that most thinkers regard that in terms of scientific thinking. Certainly, I think Aristotle would say that. Aristotle would say that the way to move from the perception of objects in the world to the comprehending mind in its final resting gaze, Aristotle would definitely say that the main way you move from here to here is through scientific reasoning. Now, there's other things as well. What I want to say to you right now, though, is that what Bonaventure does in his reinterpretation of this third moment, dianoia, or this seed-bearing vegetation of day 3 in Genesis 1, he interprets dianoia not as scientific thinking, but rather as biblical interpretation, okay? If for Aristotle, scientific reasoning is what moves you from the bottom of the line to the top of the line, which I think that is a legitimate thing to argue, for Bonaventure, it's not scientific reasoning, it's biblical interpretation, okay? I'm going to keep going. I hope that I'm making a little bit of sense. On day 4, Genesis 1 speaks of the heavenly bodies. Oh, let me see. Okay, good. Day 4, heavenly bodies. Bonaventure's understanding of that is the mind suspended, or the intellectual light of contemplation, okay? And I want to say a couple things about this real quick. First off, I hope that you can see how that maps on to the 4th moment of Plato's line, noesis. But then the other thing I want to say about that is, in my dissertation, I argued that Bonaventure is actually taking the beatific vision, which really should be on day 6 or 7, and he's importing it into day 4. And I think that makes sense, given especially the way that the medievals thought about contemplation and the mystical life. They see it as kind of a proleptic anagogia, a proleptic inbreaking of the beatific vision, okay? So
can I ask a question?
Yes, and then I'm going to summarize my point 3. Yes.
Okay, it's like a 2-part question. First, maybe for some of us here, we're thinking, why the need for Bonaventure to make this kind of correspondence in the first place? And the second one is, you've given the epistemological analysis of the line.
Yes.
Is it also a metaphysical analysis here, or is that? something that Bonaventure doesn't talk about?
No, well, I think that for Plato, it is metaphysical. I think that Bonaventure wants to redefine metaphysics in terms of history. Okay, I'll just say what Bonaventure is doing here is he's taking this hexameral way of looking at the 6 days of creation, which I'm saying structurally map onto Plato's line, and he's historicizing it. Bonaventure thinks that there's no metaphysics without history, which is why he's so amazingly interesting. That's a crazy novel concept that most people would say never entered into the stream of Western culture until Hegel. Actually, no, Bonaventure said that. That's kind of the upshot of Ratzinger's book, I would say. But Greg, so look, for Plato, it's definitely metaphysical as well as epistemological, to use your word. For Bonaventure, same, although Bonaventure wants to say additionally that it's metaphysical because it's historical, because it's historicized. All right? Now, you use the word epistemological. I actually would prefer the word phenomenological, because I think that what Plato's doing in the line, and I think Bonaventure would agree with this, and Ratzinger would certainly agree with this, is he's not asking how do we know stuff, or he's not asking how can we perform a Cartesian exercise in which we gain certainty and then on that basis come to secure knowledge of other things. No, he's providing a phenomenological description of how human beings always already think. He's not giving a method. He's not performing a Cartesian thought experiment. He's simply saying, when we reflect retrospectively on how the human mind works, this is the way it works. And that's what I mean by a phenomenological description. Now, I don't know if that makes sense. I just wanted to say, I would prefer phenomenological over epistemological here. Especially, yeah, okay. Now, your first question was, why in the world does Bonaventure feel the need to even do all this stuff in the first place? Well, good question. And this is good preparation for my actual defense, I would say. First off, I think Bonaventure just loves scripture. I mean, he just is on a pilgrimage of faith-seeking understanding in that Augustinian, Anselmian stream of tradition, and so he loves to talk about the Bible. But I think that there's two answers that strike more directly at the vitals of my project here. One of them is he is responding to the re-emergence of Aristotelian scientia in the University of Paris in the 13th century. Bonaventure is making an anti-scientific argument here. He's arguing against Aristotle, and I was gonna actually try to leave this out today, but he's making an anti-Aristotelian argument because he rightly understands that Aristotle thinks that history is unintelligible. Aristotle thinks that history is a blooming, buzzing confusion. Aristotle thinks that history is nothing but one damn thing after another. That's deeply offensive to Bonaventure. Bonaventure wants to say, hey, science on the Aristotelian model is not the be-all and end-all. There might be a place for it. He's certainly not an anti-intellectual like someone like Gabriel Biel was. But he's still wanting to say theology is not the bitch of science. He's wanting to say that Aristotle is trying to do science in an autonomous manner, and that is not acceptable to a Christian thinker. That's the first reason. So the first reason has to do with science, a scientific controversy that's been brewing in the medieval world for the previous 50 to 100 years, okay? So the first reason has to do with science. The second reason, though, has to do with eschatology, because not only is there a novel view of scientia that reemerges in this context, there's also a novel view of eschatology. And this is why Joachim of Fiore is so important. So Bonaventure is trying to make a point about history against the hegemony of science, but he's also wanting to marshal his logos of history in order to give Joachim, who's viewed as a heretic by almost everyone, he's wanting to give Joachim not a complete high five, but also not a complete rejection. He's wanting to give Joachim a middle five. And so those are the real two sort of impetuses which lead him to write this work, although it was really a sermon series. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip number 4 because I think I've already talked about it. I thought there were 6 days. Well, Bonaventure only got to day 4. By the way, the reason for that is because he was made a cardinal. But isn't it interesting how it perfectly maps onto Plato's line? I think, and isn't it interesting that as he describes day 4, not day 6 or 7, but day 4, he talks about the beatific vision. That is weird. All right. Now, look with me at number 5 on the outline, because if you look at Plato's line, I've already hinted at this, but I think that what you can do is you can take those first 2 moments, images and trust, akasia and pistis, and you can collapse them into one moment. Images without the trust that chairs and trees actually exist is worthless. You might be dreaming. So images need that kind of pistis, and pistis makes no sense apart from those images. All that to say, I think that it makes sense to take those first 2 moments and put them together into one moment. And when you do that, that 4-fold schema collapses into a 3-fold schema. And the resulting pattern I call A, B, A prime. It's structurally identical. Well, let me just say let me say it like this. What ends up happening is that you start at the bottom of the line, or you start at the bottom with day 1 and day 2 of creation, reason plus faith. By the way, did you hear that? Reason plus faith. One of the sub-themes of my dissertation is a clarification of the nature of faith. And faith is not something that stands in utter opposition to reason. No, it's something that completes reason. Now, in whose opinion? Well, Bonaventure's and Ratzinger's. And I would also say in the opinion of mainstream traditional Catholic theology. Faith is something that supplements reason, that strengthens reason, that goes along with reason, okay? But if you put those two together, what you have is an initial moment and then a sort of process of intellectual growth, let me just say a process of growth, and then you arrive at a final moment, which you could call the beatific vision, you could call a moment of the comprehending mind, you could call it a vision of the whole, W-H-O-L-E. But the important point right now is that final moment is a kind of return to the beginning. To put it a different way, it's a repetition of that first moment. Put it a different way, it's a non-identical repetition of that first moment on a higher plane. And it's very interesting, and certainly not a coincidence that also maps perfectly onto the Neoplatonist pattern of exit and return. Exit and return. Don't have time to say a lot about that, but maybe we'll come back to it in discussing Bonaventure. But what I want to say is that in my dissertation, I argue that these 4 moments really collapse down into 3, okay? 6, remember that even for Plato, the line is meant to express a phenomenological process. I already talked about that. Moving on to number 7, again, Bonaventure takes this process, because I am arguing that in Plato's line, what we see is a process. If someone wants to discuss that, that'd be awesome, but that's my reading. There's already a kind of process in view in Plato's line. What Bonaventure does is he takes this process and historicizes it. He historicizes it, particularly with day 3 dianoia, which he redefines in terms of the reading of scripture, okay? So remember, day 3 dianoia, Bonaventure doesn't have primarily in view science. scientia. No, that's not the kind of componendo et dividendo that Bonaventure's envisioning. Rather, he's envisioning something more Augustinian, something more like reading a story, something more like the story of Scripture. In fact, that is how he envisions day 3. These seed-bearing plants. I wish I had a good quote here. That's another thing that I will improve when I come to my defense. But he explicitly says that these seed-bearing fruits are the interpretations of history that will pop up in subsequent generations in the future from his point of view. It's really the first progressivist philosophy of history that the world has ever seen, except for Joachim. Look at number 7. Bonaventure takes this process and historicizes it. In doing this, he was taking an idea from Augustine and others in the hexameral tradition and developing it. The idea is that Genesis is not, in Augustine's opinion, in the opinion of this hexameral tradition, Genesis is not actual history, but rather it is a pattern of history. And now, look with me at A, B, and C under 7. I want to talk about Augustine, Joachim, and Bonaventure. I want to briefly compare and contrast how the three of them take this pattern, take Genesis 1 as a pattern for actual history, okay? And the bottom line is that Augustine says, oh, the 6 or 7 days of Genesis 1, and by the way, Ratzinger does a good job of talking about how there's always an ambiguity between the number 6 and the number 7. I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm just going to say 6 or 7. For Augustine, Genesis 1 becomes a single week of history. In other words, the 6 days of creation become a single week for Augustine. For Joachim, he builds on Augustine and says, oh, yeah, Genesis 1 is awesome, but it doesn't serve as the pattern for a single week. It serves as the pattern for a triple week or a threefold week of history. Bonaventure says, nice try, Joachim, but your threefold schema needs to be made into a twofold schema. Now, let me talk about each one of those. First, Augustine. Augustine sees the pattern of history, the pattern of Genesis 1 resulting in a single week of world history. I'm going to give you the 6 days real quick for Augustine. Day 1 is Adam to Noah. Day 2 is Noah to Abraham. Day 3, Abraham to David. Day 4, David to the Babylonian captivity. Day 5 and day 6 get you from Christ. Sorry, day 5 and day 6 get you from the Babylonian captivity to Christ / the finis mundi, the end of the world, okay? The point right now is that for Augustine, there's 1 week of history, and guess what, folks? The 1 week of history ends with Christ. Very important. Moving now to Joachim. Joachim says, okay, oops, did I screw something up? Can y'all see the PowerPoint? Okay, good. Joachim says, nope, there's 3 weeks. It's a threefold pattern. Week one is Adam to Christ. Joachim calls this the age of the Father. Week 2 is from Christ to the beginning of the Novum Ordo, the new order, which he calls the age of the Son. Week 3 is the new order to the end of the world. Okay, now, so with Joachim, you've got 3 segments, 1, 2, 3. He thinks that this is the age of the Father, the age of the Son, and the age of the Holy Spirit. Let me just say really quickly that he locates his own historical situation near the end of week 2. In other words, Joachim's big claim is that the age of the Son is about to end, and I'm predicting, Joachim says, that any day now, something crazy and apocalyptic is going to happen, and boom, the 3rd age of the Spirit is going to be ushered in. Now, I hope you can see how that's radically different from Augustine. Augustine would hate that view. I hope you can see how so many people in the church, especially those with power, thought that that was dangerous heresy. But the last thing I want to say about that real quick is that there were, well, is that it is incredibly astounding and riveting that soon after Joachim died, guess what happened? Can anyone guess what happened right after Joachim died? It's the emergence of St. Francis of Assisi. And not just St. Francis of Assisi, but also St. Dominic. It's the emergence of these new mendicant orders that began to cover the globe like no one had ever seen at any previous point in history. And people are looking around saying, oh my gosh, this is amazing what's happened. There's all these communities of spiritual men, and they're preaching the gospel, and they are ushering in peace, and people are having these mystical experiences. And so there were all these people who were followers of Joachim of Fiore. They were called the Spiritual Franciscans. And what do they say? They say, boom, Joachim was right. He was predicting the emergence of St. Francis of Assisi and all of these new communities, this new order of monastic communities that was now dotting the globe. So in other words, what the Spiritual Franciscans think, these are the followers of Joachim. In other words, they were members of the Order of St. Francis. In other words, they were active after basically St. Francis died. And what they were standing in awe of, what they regarded as an apocalyptic eschatological event of supreme importance, was not just the spread of these monastic communities, but also the life and death and the stigmata of Francis himself, okay? Now, Augustine says Genesis 1 serves as the pattern for a single week of world history ending in Christ. Joachim comes along and says, oh no, there's actually 3 epochs or weeks of world history: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And by the way, the second age of the Son is about to end. I predict that there's going to be some cataclysmic event that is going to end the second age and begin the third age of the Holy Spirit. And Joachim has all of these prophecies and predictions regarding that. And it really freaked people out. Bonaventure comes along, and I'm just going to read number C, letter C. Bonaventure adopts Joachim's progressivism. I hope that you can see how Bonaventure's schema, Joachim's schema is progressive. Is Augustine's schema progressive? Well, maybe I can come back to that later, but I just want to say right now, for Augustine, history had ended in his mind, 450 years before he was on the scene. 400 years before he was on the scene, right? So in other words, Francis Fukuyama is not the first person to talk about the end of history. Augustine is the first person, I think, I would argue, to talk about the end of history, but he thinks that history ends, for all practical purposes, with the death of Christ, or with the Christ event, you might say. So back to C, Bonaventure adopts Joachim's progressivism. He rejects the third week. In other words, he rejects this third age of the Holy Spirit. Why? Because it eclipses the preeminence of the Son, of the S-O-N. It relegates Christ to a mere joint between the second segment and the third segment. Bonaventure says that's unacceptable. So he adopts Joachim's progressivism, but he rejects the third week, and he adopts instead a double week of history. In other words, he's saying that Genesis 1 serves as the pattern for week 1 of history and week 2 of history. He adopts a double week of history, structurally identical to the pattern of exitus and reditus, exit and return, exit out of God and return back into God. And where for Augustine, Christ is the end of history, for Bonaventure, Christ is now the center of history. Christ is now the center of the itinerary of the world. Out of God and then back into God. Week 1, week 2. Okay? Y'all, I have about 17 minutes. Any questions? That takes me through Roman numeral 1. I'm probably, well, I'm going to end very soon. I have to. Any questions about that? I hope that I'm making sense, at least to some extent. Let's
So the question, Neoplatonism, how does that fit in there? Is Bonaventure a Neoplatonist, or
absolutely. Bonaventure is absolutely a Neoplatonist. I mean, if you think back to my presentation of Plato's line, as well as the 4 days of creation, it's utterly Neoplatonist. I mean, you could argue that day 1, natural reason, is divine illumination. That is Christian Neoplatonism. That the only reason human beings are able to know anything, Christian Neoplatonists like Augustine don't claim that one needs faith in order to have knowledge. No. But what they do claim is that one needs divine illumination. Yes. But that divine illumination is natural reason. It's the forms. Okay? So absolutely, Augustine was a Christian Neoplatonist. By the way, one of the things in my dissertation that I have to be careful about is mischaracterizing Thomas Aquinas. I do not want to mischaracterize Thomas Aquinas. And let me just say that Thomas Aquinas is also a Christian Neoplatonist. But yeah, does that answer your question, Greg? Good. Okay. Now, y'all, we need to take a quantum leap forward and sort of...
Question.
Yeah?
In what sense is Thomas Aquinas a neo?
Oh, I just think that he totally is down with divine illumination theory. I mean, he's always talking about the light of reason. His favorite verse is the psalm that says, "In your light we see light." He definitely supplements Augustine's theory of Aristotle's theory of knowledge with an Augustinian notion and a Platonist notion of the forms that come to us by way of divine illumination, in my opinion. Yeah?
Does he a similarly developed view of history?
Negative. Absolutely negative. In fact, Thomas Aquinas simply gives Joachim a thumbs down. That's not 100% true, but it's 98% true. Thomas, when it comes to history and time, and by the way, you need to understand that time and history are connected, right? When it comes to history and time, Thomas Aquinas is identical to Aristotle. Aristotle, who in book 4 of the Physics defines time, aka chronos, as a mere accident of motion. Bonaventure says that is hogwash. And oh, by the way, Thomas Aquinas, that's why you're willing to entertain the possibility of the eternality of the world. Shame on you. Bonaventure does 2 things. One is he says that tempus, or time, is actually one of the 4 original things that God packed into creation. So you know how Empedocles had the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. Bonaventure has 4 elements, but they are tempus, time, the angelic world, prime matter, and the empyrean. The point is, Bonaventure is definitely a temporal-oriented thinker, much like St. Augustine, much like postmodern thinkers like Henri Bergson, and also Martin Heidegger. The other thing I wanted to say, though, about in response to your question, Robert. Oh, yeah. So I would say that Thomas Aquinas just swallows Aristotle hook, line, and sinker in terms of Aristotle's definition of time in terms of chronos, the tick-tock of the chronometer. In other words, time that is merely instrumental, merely formal, merely objective, merely neutral. And Augustine wants to say, oh, no, there's lots more to time than just that. And I don't think that he uses the Greek word kairos, although Martin Heidegger does use the Greek word kairos. But basically, one of the things that I'm arguing, and one of the things that I think that Ratzinger's arguing, is that Bonaventure looks at the Aristotelians of his day in 13th century Paris, not primarily Thomas Aquinas, but I think that Thomas Aquinas does not remain unscathed from this critique. And he says, shame on you. There's much more to time than just Aristotelian chronos. You have to understand that there's also kairos, which opens a whole new door to other ways of thinking about time, including the angelic realm, and including the sort of thing that Augustine talks about in Confessions, Book 11, when Augustine says that time is a distentio of the soul. In other words, it's radically subjective. All right. Roman numeral 2, from history to story. I'm going to have to keep this super brief, like insanely brief. Maybe I'll just read and resist the temptation to elaborate. In the context of day 3, Ratzinger's Bonaventure, so I'm talking about day 3, right? The seed-bearing fruit, what Bonaventure interprets as biblical interpretations which drive history forward. In the context of day 3, Ratzinger's Bonaventure thinks that when we read scripture, we are reading a story, the Historia Salutis, the history of salvation. Wait, is it a story or is it history? For the modern mind, those things are very different. But for certain thinkers, they're not so different. Certain thinkers like C.S. Lewis, Paul Ricoeur, Charles Peggy, 20th century Catholic French guy, and Catherine Pickstock, who I alluded to earlier. And I just want to, so for certain thinkers, the Historia Salutis can be regarded as both a myth/narrative and history. Why is that? It is because for these people, history is inherently and essentially narratival. One of the big claims of my dissertation, and this is not original. I think that the stuff about Plato's line is actually original, which is why it makes me really, really scared. I'm like, oh, crap. Are people going to make fun of me? But this right here is not original. But I rely on it and try to develop it in my dissertation, and that is that there's no such thing as history apart from story. There's no such thing as history without narrative. There's no such thing as history without mythos. And super briefly, I'm just going to read number 1 about Ricoeur and number 2 about Pickstock. Ricoeur's argument for this point, reading a story relies on the hermeneutic circle. Again, A, B, A prime, exit and return, non-identical repetition on a higher plane. This Ricoeur's hermeneutical circle is the same exact process as Gadamer's historical fusion of horizons. Alas, I do not have time to talk about Gadamer's historical fusion of horizons. So I'm going to go to number 2, which I find even more interesting anyway. Pickstock's argument for this point. What point? The point that there's no such thing as history without narrative. Pickstock's argument for this point, building on Charles Peggy, is that history's intelligibility is rooted in the dynamics of divine illumination theory or non-identical repetition. And I'm going to keep reading. This is the kind of thing that really I need 3 more hours to talk about, but I'm just going to read what I have on the page. Pickstock argues that an imagined double, which is her language for Platonic form, is necessary to regard any object in the world like a frog, a chair, or a maple leaf. But for Pickstock and Charles Peggy, an event like the French Revolution is no different from a leaf or a frog or a chair. They both require some kind of imagined double, some kind of divine illumination, some kind of Platonic form in order to make sense of them at all. In other words, in order to do what Ratzinger says is always already a part of divine revelation, namely, do you remember? Interpretation. in order to interpret any kind of event, whether it's the French Revolution or God in a burning bush in Exodus 3, what Pickstock says is you have to have an imagined double, divine illumination, a Platonic form in your mind in order to make sense of that thing at all. And I'm going to read a quote. I'm going to read a paragraph about Peggy on whom Pickstock relies. Peggy's big saying, his big motto, his big aphorism is, in order for an event to happen, like the French Revolution, in order for an event to happen, it must happen twice. That is, the human mind must perceive / recognize / interpret an event. This is the second happening or the repetition of the origin. But this perception / recognition / interpretation is only possible by virtue of some kind of imagined double, which is structurally identical to Platonic form / divine illumination / the unknown known of Meno's paradox. What I want you to see is that this is an incipient philosophy of history. In other words, Peggy's statement, in order for an event to happen, it must happen twice, that is an incipient philosophy of history. And B, that it functions by virtue of the same logic as divine illumination theory. That brings me, y'all, to Roman numeral 3. I'll bet I can do this in 5 minutes, especially if I just read what I have. So we've talked about history, narrative, and now finally eschatology, okay? Or the end of history. Bonaventure, channeling the spirit of Joachim of Fiore, is not the only thinker to imagine history in terms of progress. Indeed, Steven Pinker does that, as we've already seen. Also, look at this quote right here. The moral arc of history is long. It bends toward justice. Martin Luther King Jr., also quoted and paraphrased by Barack Obama. This is a popular 10-cent version of historical progressivism. What I'm trying to say is that it begins with Joachim / Bonaventure. Also, obviously, there's academic versions. I'm on A2. There's academic versions of this. Hegel, Steven Pinker, Darwin's theory of evolution, proponents of transhumanism are also definitely philosophical historicists who are arguing for a progressive eschatology. It may be a secular eschatology, but it still, in a historicist way, relies on theology nonetheless. Also, Teilhard Desjardins. B, in this progressivism, Bonaventure departs from Augustine, who regards history as mere chronicles. When historians talk about chronicles, what they mean is like a big mess, just one damn thing after another, no intelligibility, no structure, no order, no eidos. What I'm saying, I'm actually, and I think, and Ratzinger is actually siding with Bonaventure against Augustine in this specific sense. Bonaventure departs from Augustine, who regards history as mere chronicles, in other words, a blooming, buzzing confusion, one damn thing after another, aka, and if you look at the outline here, the saeculum senescens. That means the world that is just growing old and decrepit, kind of like a muscle that is atrophying. That is how Augustine regards human time, the history of human culture after Christ, the saeculum senescens. That is from the City of God. I forget which chapter, but it's near the end of the City of God. C, against Augustine, Bonaventure thinks that we can view all of history as a great story. It is, therefore, intelligible. D, this presupposes that we can, in some sense, know the end of history. In other words, the story must have an intelligible ending. And y'all, in 2 minutes, I'm going to conclude by rehearsing what I've tried to say. A, history is a mythos. Doesn't mean it's not true. On the contrary, read C.S. Lewis's article, Myth Become Fact. History is a mythos. B, thanks to theology, history is constitutive of metaphysics. What Ratzinger's Bonaventure is trying to argue is that there's no such thing as metaphysics without history. Now that can only be true given Christian theology. In other words, that's not true for Aristotle. I'm talking about the historical Aristotle in the 4th, 5th century before Christ. That's not true for Aristotle, but after the incarnation of the divine Logos, which is a historical event, Bonaventure's right that any metaphysics must involve history. As Bonaventure insists, there is finally no metaphysics without history. The greatest example of this is Hegel, who explicitly admits the theological character of his thought, that is, of his philosophy of history. And then C, oops, I forgot to go to my conclusion. Can y'all see that? I'm on C. As such, the dynamics of divine illumination theory, or as such, given the dynamics of divine illumination theory, we can see the whole, we can grasp the eidos of history. Obviously, this requires biblical revelation, but my claim, Bonaventure's claim, this is why he departs from Augustine. We can grasp the eidos of history. Hence, history is not simply a matter of the world growing old and decrepit. The end. I have some other stuff. I have an amazing quote. This is a quote of Bonaventure in which he states that that metaphysics requires history. This is a very long quote by Hegel. It is amazing. I'm not a card-carrying Hegelian, but I do want to argue that Hegel is dependent upon Bonaventure and upon Joachim. Hegel is essentially a secular eschatology. And this is a very long quote in which he admits that his entire system presupposes the historical event of the incarnation. Okay? Yup, that's it for me. Thanks for listening. I've got 1 hour and 16 minutes.
We've got, good. We've got, well, till the official end of the meeting, we've got about 9 minutes. So go ahead. If you have a question, unmute yourself and ask away.
Very good to see everyone.
I was kind of struck, Matt, by your claim that Aquinas is a Platonist.
Well, I said he was a Christian Neoplatonist. Yeah. You know, that's a deep, do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, I've never heard that before.
Wow. That's amazing. I mean, so some people who would say that, let me think here. Well, I would say that that's kind of a deep divide within Catholic thought, 20th century Catholic thought. Certainly the ressourcement theologians like de Lubac, Balthasar, Ratzinger, Yves Congar would regard Thomas Aquinas as a Neoplatonist. And again, if you just look at all the places where I'm not saying that he's not an Aristotelian. He is. In fact, all Neoplatonists are Aristotelians. But Thomas, I would say, is an Aristotelian, even in a stronger way. I don't deny that at all. But I do think that he gives a high five to divine illumination theory. I can't quote chapter and verse in the Summa, but yeah.
So is it just in respect to his divine illumination theory?
Even the structure of the Summa is patterned on the schema of exit and return. It's I can't rehearse the details right now, but but the Summa Theologiae it begins with God, it flows out to all sorts of things like Christ and the church, and it ends back up with God. No, it's not limited to divine illumination theory.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
But I mean, to be honest, I'm a little, I don't feel prepared to talk about additional ways that Thomas is a Neoplatonist, and yeah.
Okay.
But I think
As
that,
I said, it just kind of struck me.
well, let me just say, like, I don't think that it's, I don't think that it's shocking that surprises you, precisely because, remember Schmaus, who rejected Ratzinger's Habilitationsschrift. Schmaus was a Neo-Thomist. What is the papal document? Is it Aeterni Patris or Lumen Gentium? It's Lumen Gentium, right? Where, again, I need to bone up on this big time for my defense, where basically Thomas Aquinas was sort of instantiated as the great authority for Catholic thought, sort of in an effort to oppose the secular philosophy of Europe. I think that's Lumen Gentium. And then, yeah.
Not my field.
Oh, well, anyway, I would say that, like, I think that's 1879. And ever since then, like, I'm painting with very broad brushstrokes, right? But conservative Catholics, AKA Neo-Thomists, AKA people who resisted Vatican II, would probably not they would probably not agree with the Ressourcement theologians in their read of Thomas as a Neoplatonist. So all I'm trying to say is, in even to this day, in many Catholic circles, Catholic universities, like people like this guy, Whipple, and others, like there's certain old school Catholic types who would not like that claim. Although Whipple, I mean, really, it's really irrefutable. I mean, but many old school Catholics would not like to characterize Thomas as a Neoplatonist. But again, the Ressourcement theologians and also my people, Radical Orthodoxy, they definitely do.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Here's what I want to know. Does this kind of sort of make sense?
Kind of, sort of, yes.
Good. I'll take.
Yeah, I have a question. That is
it's philosophy of history. You know, I mean,
yeah.
it's a weird field, but one of the big points is that it presupposes the historical advent of theology.
Right. So my question now is, at the very beginning of your presentation, you used a contemporary example of Steven Pinker, and I can't remember who his conversation partner was.
Yeah.
Who was it?
Baton.
Okay. So if you're the opening suggestion was that what Pinker is suggesting is dependent on something like you're arguing.
Yeah. I think so.
What would be the contemporary mirror image of Pinker? And now, in light of what you have been suggesting, what would be the contemporary arguments against this?
Well, and
here's what I found.
Shut up, Siri. So, well, one way to answer that question would be Alain de Botton, his interlocutor in that Munk debate. But I'm not trying to argue. I am not taking issue with Steven Pinker's historical progressivism. I actually am a modified historical progressivist, as is Joseph Ratzinger and St. Bonaventure. I was just trying to say that he's dependent upon historical developments that have preceded him. That's a very Nietzschean move of mine. It's a very Michel Foucault type move. It's a move that it's a historicist move. It claims that that there's such a thing as a historical a priori, that's Foucault's term, or historical conditions for the possibility of certain concepts in our world. And I was just trying to give an example of a pop culture example of contemporary progressivism that most people don't even think about. So I don't disagree with Pinker vis-a-vis progressivism. I just think that apart from Christian theology, there's really no good reasons to be a progressivist. And that he should deeply, deeply examine the historical conditions of his thought, which he would never be willing to do, in order to realize that the historical foundations of his thought are theological. Those are my reasons for bringing up Pinker.
John Glenn, I see you've unmuted your mic. Do you have a question?
I do.
Hey, Greg. Is that John Glenn?
Yes. Hey, hi, John. Are you?
Oh my gosh.
I heard somebody else has a question too, but John, I'm having trouble hearing you.
So I just, while John's getting unmuted or whatever, I just have to say that John Glenn was my dad's roommate in college at the University of Texas.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
It's amazing.
Somebody else had a question? John, if you want to type your question in, I can read it. I don't know why we're not able to hear you.
Mine should be, I did. It should be short.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm doing a PowerPoint over Thomas Aquinas for my Intro to World Religions class, and was wondering if y'all knew of any specific beliefs he held or events that happened in his life that I should be sure to go over.
Yeah, the rediscovery of Aristotle in the 12th century. Rediscovery in quotes. I mean, it fundamentally changed the way that people tried to talk about God. One way of putting it would be it fundamentally changed the way people did theology, although the very meaning of the term theology gets shifted precisely because of the reemergence of Aristotle. But I would say that.
I would say he says you can't do metaphysics until you're 50 years old, and he died at 49.
Don't listen to him.
Brent, I see you have your hand raised. You have a question?
I do. Early in the presentation, you started talking about the eschaton and the idea that you need to understand the beginning to understand the end. And at one point, you discussed kind of the days, and I can't remember who it was, that history ends with Christ. Is that the eschaton in that particular person, or does anybody talk about, say, beyond that?
Okay, so that's St. Augustine, and he does say that Christ is the eschaton. Or, I mean, I don't think that he explicitly says that. It's in City of God. Yeah, it's in City of God, and he does say that Christ is the eschaton. So to answer your question, until Joachim of Fiore, basically, there may have been one or two very minor predecessors to Joachim, like I can't think of their names right now. They're obscure early medievals, but until Joachim of Fiore, Brent, Augustine was the only game in town.
So in our modern sense, we talk about all millennialists and premillennialists and that kind of thing. Does anybody have any thought like that, or is it let's bring history up to Christ and that's it, not really think about beyond that?
That's a great question. So first off, Augustine. Yeah, I want to say something really interesting, Brent, because I think you're a Baptist pastor, right?
Former.
Okay, cool. So what I just find it so fascinating that you use the words amillennialism, premillennialism, postmillennialism. Those words do not appear in, can y'all see me right now? I can't see myself. Those words do not appear in this book or in this book. And in fact, I've never heard a Catholic theologian utter those words. I mean, so I did my coursework at the University of Dallas. Those are just very evangelical modern words as far as I can tell. Now, by the way, that's not to say that they're stupid. It's just something that I've noticed that I find really, really interesting.
Well, that's part of my question is, are those terms a modern thing? Anything equivalent in the medieval, or is it medieval has a very much more narrow view of the eschaton?
Good. Now, okay, so I think that the most helpful way for me to answer your question is there was a thing called chiliasm. And chiliasm is this view that the 1,000-year period mentioned in Revelation 20 is literal. So Origen was a chiliast. That's one of the reasons why he was like shunned and marginalized and not made a saint. Yeah, Augustine was not a chiliast. He did not believe that that 1,000-year period in Revelation 20 is to be interpreted literally. And that's really what it ought to mean to be an amillennialist. Yeah. I think that I think that you'd have to, you know what? I think I would be willing to wager that Joachim could be thought of as the first major post-millennialist in the history of the church, because he does believe, he is a chiliast. He does believe with Origen that it's a literal 1,000-year period, and he thinks that you know what? I'm fizzling out. What I wanted to say, he thinks that there's some eschatological good. Let me just put it like this. He's a progressivist. He thinks that history is getting better and better, like Steven Pinker. I need to drill down on that a bit more. My understanding of a postmillennialist is someone who believes that the return of Christ will happen after that literal 1,000-year period. And I'm not prepared to say that Joachim believes that right now.
So technically or officially we are done, but there's one more question, at least from John. And so I want to read that, but I just want to thank everybody for coming, and just to thank Matt for just a great talk, and wish him well on his defense whenever that happens. I hope it's not too long. But one more question here in the text or the chat from John Glenn. He says, a very simple question. What if the human race is destroyed by a cataclysm in, say, 110 years? Does that mean that there really wasn't human history because our story didn't have an end in the sense of a telos, that is a fulfilled telos, the realization of an eschaton?
What a great question. And it's not simple. Greg, can you repeat the first sentence, the first clause?
What if the human race is destroyed by a cataclysm in, say, 110 years?
Yeah, I would say that it does mean that, John. I think that it does mean that. And I think that for Bonaventure it means that. I think that for Ratzinger it means that. And I myself, Matt Boulter, would agree with them that it does mean, that it would mean that. Yeah. In that case, so it's interesting how the word telos is ambiguous, right? It includes the notion of an end point, but it also includes the notion of a purpose or a goal. And yeah, I mean, Bonaventure definitely thinks that human history has a goal. And if that were to happen, that would be wrong. And therein lies our Christian hope, I would argue. There's a lot more to be said about that. And John, I would highly recommend this book by Joseph Pieper, The End of Time, because I would not want to argue that we should, on the basis of theology, belittle the possibility of ultimate cataclysmic catastrophe. No, that does not follow from this theological claim that Bonaventure and Ratzinger and I make. But maybe I should leave it at that for now. Thank you all.
All right, thank you, everybody. And if you, Matt, if you want to hang out for another minute or two, see if there's any remaining questions.
Sure.
Hope to see everybody at our next symposium, hopefully in person, but we'll see. Bye, everybody.